the church, why, you know, we live by miracles, but sometimes it takes a lifetime to realize that we had many miracles in our life. But I guess the greatest miracle that I had in my life is when I went into the service. And in there, why, I had to be an LDS. I was the only one that was LDS, and I had quite a bit of opposition. A lot of guys trying to ridicule and put me down for, they'd say, well, a cigarette or a little drink ain't going to hurt you. And this went on for quite a while, and then I finally kind of backed up and I said, well, I know that they does hurt you, and I can prove it. And they said, well, how are you going to prove it? It hurts you. And when I was here on the ranch, I used to run to school and back, and I was got to be quite a foot racer. And they called me Steamboat. And so I didn't like that name, Steamboat. But anyway, as I I told them, I said, well, I'll outrun any 10 of you guys in a foot race, in a relay. And they thought that was quite funny and ridiculous. And they got excited, and they wanted to know if I wanted to do any betting and put up somebody in and all this. And I said, well, I don't believe in betting either, but I guess for the sake of the deal, I'll put up whatever money you want to bet on it. And the word got out around the ship real fast, you know, that I was going to outrun any 10 of the guys in the relay. And they, of course, they was talking us up all over, and we was out at sea, and I couldn't do any runs. We got in. It was 3 weeks later before we got in. But anyway, when we got into shore there, I said, guys were saying, well, you ready for the race? And I said, yeah, I'm ready. You guys ready? Yeah, we got our man picked out, and we're going to, and I said to him, then I said, well, remember I said I'd call a distance on the race? And they said, yeah, what is your distance? And I said, 5 miles. And they said, 5 miles? 5 miles? You're going to run 5 miles? And I said, yeah, I'm going to run 5 miles. So you got the guys that can run a half a mile? And they all really tired out right quickly. That was the end of that race before it got started. The thing that I didn't realize that these stories was all getting to the top captain. You know, I didn't realize that at the time. But everybody on the ship, including all the officers and the captain, knew about me, Mormon, and these things. And so later we had a guy come on our ship that he didn't like me at all, because I had my standards, and he was going around and getting all the guys, finally trying to turn them against me. He did pretty good there for a while. He was a great big guy, and he, anyway, he was really giving me a bad time and trying to turn all the guys away from me because I wouldn't counter to him. And one day, somebody had the boxing gloves out on the mantel of the ship, and he was hollering, put them on, Wilkerson, and swing. And I didn't want to put them on, but I thought, well, how do I get out of this, you know? And I did a little boxing. And so when they got the gloves on, I went in to tip my gloves with him, and he had different ideas. He hit me right side the head while I was getting ready to tip the gloves.
Oh.
And it really dazed me, and I just backed off and jerked the gloves off, and I thought, well, I got to wait for another time. But anyway, I went up, got the punching bag out of the locker and took it up, and the punching bag is right behind the captain's office, and I started working out on this. You know, I didn't want, next time I got up against him, I didn't want to get covered, and so I was beating that punching bag about 45 the minutes a day, you know, and the captain come out and he says, Wilkerson, what are you trying to do to me? I said, oh, can you hear this and that? He says, every bit of it. Coming right through that buckboard. And I says, well, I'm getting ready. I said, do you remember that big swing guy? Come on. I said, I'm getting ready to flatten him out on the deck. I thought, you know, I wouldn't know what to expect from that, but he says, I'm going to have to put you on a schedule so that you're not interrupting my schedule so much, and I can be out of my office while you're pounding that thing. And he did, and anyway, when I was out on the deck, he used to come down and chew the guys out, and he'd say, well, how are you, Mr. Wilkerson? And then we was down in Panama, and I got a letter. We'd been around Panama for about 7 months, in and out, not going too far away. And I got a letter from my brother, Aaron. He was over in England. And, well, to get back to the other story, I finally called this Swain, you know, when we started mouthing off at me, and I said, well, come up. He was down unloading the barge, and he was mouthing off, and all the guys having fun with it. And I said, come up on the deck. I said, it's time that I shut your mouth. And he wouldn't. He had all kinds of excuses. He said, well, we'll get in trouble. I said, I don't care. I said, I ain't going to hear any more of your bad language. And mouthing off all the time. And I says, this is it. It's you and me. And he wouldn't come up. And of course, as soon as that ship hit the dry land, well, he was off of there. He got transferred and left. But when my brother sent me a letter from England, and he says, well, I'm getting married on a certain date. He says, sure be nice if you could be here. And I guess it was about a month or maybe a little more away. I said, yeah, I'd sure like to be there, but I don't suppose that can happen. Me in South America and you in England. And so after a few days, while our ship got underway and we headed out to sea, and the captain come on and he says, well, we're going up to Norfolk, Virginia, on our way to Norfolk. And so we went up to Norfolk, and then we got underway again and went up to Baltimore. And he told us we were going to go to Baltimore, and then we went to New York. And we was there, around there for a while, and then we got underway again, and the captain come on, and he said, we're headed to England. And he says, we're only going to be there 3 days. He says, I know that some of you guys have got brothers there, but we can't give you any leave. You have to be, you know, you have to be close to that ship on 3-day pass. You only get base liberty. And he says, we can't give you guys any leave there. We'll just be base liberty. And so, after sailing a while, I went up to talk to the captain. I said to the captain, I said, do you know why we're going to England? And he says, he says, no, he says, I haven't received any orders yet. And then he looked at me and he says, do you know why we're going to England? And I said, yeah, I know why we're going to England. I says, I got a brother that's getting married, and we're going to get there the day before the wedding. And he says, oh, he says, no, that couldn't be. And I talked to him a while and started telling him a little about it. And he says, well, he says, you heard my orders, there ain't going to be any leave. And I said, well, yeah, but my brother's getting married and we're headed to England. And so he started to believe him. but he was caught between a hard rock and a brick wall, I guess. And I didn't realize that captain did not dare give me leave. He said, he says, if I give you leave, I'm going to have to give you 3 days leave to go from Liverpool up to Bristol, I guess it was Bristol. And he said, I'm going to give you full-time leave. And I said, yeah, full-time leave. And so he said that'd be impossible, and he was doing all the talking, and I was just agreeing. He was trying to get out and didn't know how to get out of it. And he says, well, I got you on restriction for the ship. And I said, yeah. I jumped overboard to save this guy that went overboard.
You need to tell him about that. That was really interesting, about how you jumped overboard to save those guys.
Well, anyway, the two guys that fell overboard, and we was out in a big storm. And it wasn't a real breaking storm, but it was a big rolling waves storm. And every time we'd try to get close to these guys, well, the big wave would come in and zoom, push them out to sea. And the one guy, he got his clothes off and he swam back that threw him the lifeline. But the other guy, he got his clothes part way off and didn't take his shoes off first and got tangled up. And he was out for 45 minutes in the water, unconscious. And so when they finally moved in close, why, nobody's doing anything. So I hurried, took my clothes off, and over I went. Well, there was another guy, and he didn't see me, and I didn't see him, but he had the same deal to get these clothes off and get in the water and get him before the wave come in. And as I went over, why, the water was up about 12 feet from the deck. It was moving out just as I jumped, and so I was going down along the side of the ship, and all these footings on the side of the ship was showing up, and it come to the 87-foot mark before I hit the water. The wave was going down as I was going down. But
3:30, okay?
anyway, I got a hold of him after a while, and the other guy got a hold of him, and then they threw us a lifeline and tried to pull us out of there, and they was having a struggle, but we locked our legs down, and it got us up to the rail, and then they dropped us.
They dropped you again.
Made a big splash, and I could hear that captain screaming at the guys, get him on there, get a hold of that line, and anyway, we got him on, and we got up, and I didn't have any idea that guy could be survived from that, but they gave him, pumped that water at him, manually, 45 minutes of pumping, and finally he was walking around on the ship after a while, just a few hours. But the captain had give me and the other guy a deck court-martial for doing this. He said that wasn't the thing to do, to go over without permission from the officer of the deck. That we just and he said it was a great thing you did, but I'm going to have to punish you for this, you know. So he put me on 3-week probation without liberty, and that was only I'd only used up about 1 week, and that was out at sea. So, but anyway, the captain, he didn't know how to get out of this, you know, and after a while he says, "Man, this is going to be the most expensive wedding I ever heard of." Ship coming from South America to England to get me there for this wedding, and he didn't know how to get out, and he would start to tell me, you know, what was taking place, and he says, "If you're not back to this ship, I'm just going to have to leave you," you know. He says, I hope you realize what a situation you got me in here. Yeah. I shake my head, you know, and so anyway, finally consented, you know, to let us go. And so when we pulled up to the dock there, all the girls come down to pick up a sailor. That's one place I had seen that. And there in England, the girls come by the hundreds down there to pick up the sailors, and they walked off the ship. And so I made a mistake of talking to a couple of them, and they says, "We'll meet you down at the deck when you get tied up." And I didn't say any more to them then, and so when I got ready to leave the ship, I seen these two girls. Most of the guys had already gone off, and I seen these two girls waiting for me, and I went back to the captain's office, and I said, "I got another problem." And he said, "What's this?" You know, he'd swear and curse. And, "What's that problem you got now?" I says, "I'm going to have to jump ship and go down the bow line." I said, "There's girls down there waiting for me." I said, did you see what's down there?" And he says, "Yeah." And I said, "Those two girls is waiting for me down there, and I can't get stopped by them. I can't get stopped by anybody." And I said, "I'm going to have to jump ship." And he said, "Well, how do you suppose to do that?" And I said, "I'm going to have to hand over hand down the front bow line." Had these big lines, you know, that tied the ship up. And he looked at me and he said, "Can you do that?" And I said, "Yeah, I can do that." And he said, "Well, boy, this puts a whole new light on it." He says, I'm gonna have to warn every officer on the ship so that you don't get shot going down that lifeline." And he wanted to keep it quiet as possible. And now he's got to tell all these officers that I'm going to jump ship. And so, anyway, he says, "This is bad. This is pretty bad." And he says, "Go ahead." And all that officers know that you're jumping ship. And anyway, when I got off there, I had to go on the dead run just as hard as I could go and get out of there. And I finally got a cab, and then I got a train, and then I headed up to Blackburn. And I got there, and I found the brother's fiance's house, and then I went in and called the base, talked to the captain, and told him who I was, and asked him if it was possible to get the brother Aaron on the phone. And he come up, and I said, "Well, I'm here." I said, "Who's here?" And he says, "Is this Ken?" And I said, "Yeah." "Where are you?" I said, I'm here in Bristol." And he says, "Oh, no." He says, "That's impossible." I said, "I know it, but I'm here." And so after I convinced him, talked to him, he come on a high run in the ambulance. He was coming down the road, and the siren was wide open. And he come barreling in the driveway, and so then he got me, and we went back to the base there, and he was still driving 70 miles an hour on those narrow streets on the wrong side of the road, scaring the heck out of me. And siren wide open, and I thought it was going to crash any time because I was driving on the opposite side of the road than I was used to. But anyway, when we got back to the base, well, the air went in, and he was on the real friendly side with the captain somehow, and in fact, all the men in his company, I guess, were real close. And he said, "Captain, this is my brother." He says, "Is it all right if I take him around and show him this?" And the captain, he reached in his pocket, and he said, "Take my car." And so, anyway, the next day was a wedding, and it was held in a big Lutheran chapel. It was a real large chapel. And the whole chapel was full of service guys. His company. It was very full. It was just the bride's parents there and the bridesmaid and 2 or 3 others. Her father was a serviceman, and it was clear full. And when we, after the wedding, when we come out, why, the streets were packed. Both ways for 4 or 5 blocks. The people were just jammed in there to see this miracle that was taking place. It hit the headlines, the paper, and it was out on the streets. And this had to be the biggest miracle of the whole thing. It hit the newspaper, and how could it possibly happen? I keep thinking the captain wouldn't have dared to surely put that in there.
No.
And if he did, he'd had to call it in ahead of time before we even landed. He'd had to call that in, and he was trying to keep it as quiet as possible. But it was in the headlines. 2 American brothers meeting for the first time in 3.5 years in the service, and that I'd arrived just in time for his wedding. And so the people, I don't know if there's enough people in that town to fill all those streets, but they wanted to see this miracle taking place. And I guess the English people, they really go hog wild over something like this. Americans would just pass it off as nothing, but the English people, they like things like this. I mean, they was jammed those streets, and there was about 15 cops out there trying to move them back so we could get out to our cars. And we had quite a struggle just getting their cars, and then we finally got in our cars. Why, we went to this certain restaurant that was out quite a ways, and had a big dinner, and a lot of his buddies close. But the thing that amazed me is that there was that many servicemen that was close to my brother that way that wanted to be there for that wedding, and he was really a jovial guy, and he was supernatural strong. And I don't know if that's why he's popular or not, but he could really take care of himself. And but he was the best natured guy ever. I mean, he was just a real good natured guy. And so anyway, after this luncheon, these bridesmaids was hanging on both sides of me, and they was making big plans for that evening, and I knew that I had to get out there and go. While this luncheon was, as soon as this luncheon got partly over, I had to sneak out and take off. And that, finally I excused myself and said, well, I'll be back in a minute. I was running to the restroom, and I got out there. I mean, I had to hurry and grab a cab and get out of there. And so then I finally got on a slow train that goes along there. It was really slow. And I got back to Liverpool, and then I got a cab, and I told this, jumped in the cab, and I said, the cab guy says, I'm in a big hurry. I says, you got to get in the cab. Oh, I got. He'd go along, and once in a while he'd jump out and run around behind. And I thought, what is that crazy guy doing? And I got out and went around to see what he was doing, and he was stirring up the charcoal. Old charcoal burner.
Oh, is that what the cab was? An old charcoal burner?
Charcoal burner. And, I thought, oh boy, I was sweating blood by then. But anyway, I finally got back to the ship, and I had 1 hour left before that ship sailed. And that captain that was out there on the deck,
looking for you.
sweating, I guess. And so when I walked up, I looked up, and there he was. And he had a big old wide grin on his face, and then he disappeared. I don't know if he got out of there. Well, I guess he had to go order to get underway, pull in the lifelines. And I didn't see him for quite a while then, but I guess he was sweating blood. Probably a lot more than I was, because he was laying his whole career right on the line there, giving me this leave. He was just waiting and pacing the deck, I guess, till I got there. But the whole thing had to be a miracle from the very beginning to the end. There's no other explanation. You can't say, well, it just happened. There's no way that it could possibly happen that I would get there the day before, get to the wedding, have another day to get back on ship, and I didn't think about this in my early life, but as other miracles came up in my life similar, I realized that this captain, he sounded like a Gentile to hear him cuss and swear, that somewhere along the line of 3 years being on this ship, he was made halfway a believer, you know, and I guess he had heard all the stories and things I didn't know he did, but he knew what was going on, and he always treated me like I was royal. He knew me, and he always treated me as royalty, and that might have been a royal priesthood wedding, because we had the priesthood, and it had to happen according to the Lord, and that captain did not dare say no. It took me 30 years or more, I guess, to realize what a spot he was on and how it all come about. But as I went through my life, and a lot of these other miracles came up in my life and things, I can look back on that and say that was the highlight of my life, and it had to be the greatest miracle that ever took place in my lifetime. So that ought to be enough for right now.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, this window should be.
When I came back from California, when I was, I guess I was 17 when I came back from California, living down there with my folks, and I stayed here on the ranch alone. And we had quite a few horses, and I had 3 horses on my own, and they were raced like horses, and that was quite a miracle how we got these mares that were hot rod race horses. They weren't full, but they were 3/4. But the horse I want to tell about is the one that I got given to me. And I was back here, and I went to work for one of the guys in town here that do you want to know if I'd come over and help him irrigate for 3 days. And I just worked part days for him irrigating for 3 days. And when I went over there, why, he had a beautiful little horse that he's tied up in the corral. And I went over and looked at it, and I thought, man, that's a pretty horse. And then I went on out to the field to irrigate, and when I come back, the horse is still tied up in the corral. And so I looked at it again, and then I went home. And the next day, I came along, and his little horse was tied up in the corral. And I had to go look at him again, walk around him, and I thought, I wonder why they're keeping him tied up in the corral. And when I got ready to go home, the same thing. The third day I came, and he was still tied up in the corral. And I walked over and looked at him. The guy came over and he said, would you like to buy that horse? And I said, no, I got too many horses now. I can't afford another horse. And he said, I'd sell you him real cheap. And I said, no, I can't afford any horses. I'm too poor to buy a good horse. And anyway, he when I got ready to leave that evening, why he says, "I'll sell you that horse for $25." And I said, $25? That horse? And I ran over there looking. This time I was looking close to see what was wrong with him. I was expecting the bad foot or something. I knew he was a beautiful horse, but I thought, well, he got something pretty badly wrong with him. But he's going to sell me that horse for $25. And then I said, well, no, I can't. I don't see anything wrong with him. He said, oh, no, there's nothing wrong with him. He says, if you want that horse, he says, I'll give him to you for this 3 days that you help me here. He says, if you don't take him, I'll have to send him to the fish hatchery for fish meat. And I said, well, I guess I'll have to take him then. I can't let you take that horse to the fish hatchery if there's nothing wrong with him. Well, it didn't take me very long to find out what was wrong with him. There wasn't nothing wrong with him physically. I found that out in a hurry. I threw a rope on him and he put me right up on top of the haystack. And so I led him home then and got over town there from Neola. And my old saddle, I thought I had better put my saddle on him. I'd better go get my uncle's saddle and put on him to ride him. So I went, stopped by my uncle's house there, and I says, is it all right if I borrow your saddle? I got a wild horse here I need to break. And he says, yeah, take it. So I put his saddle on that horse and got on him, and he let me on him. And then he went up in spins. And I mean, he was bucking all over town. The people out waving their hat. They on him, Wilkerson, stay on him. He was a small horse, and he really knew how to buck, but he wasn't really I mean, he wasn't big enough to really jar you too bad. And I rode a lot of bucking horses when I was young. And I was really hoping I'd hang in there, though, because he was, after about 15 minutes of bucking, most horses would buck themselves out in a minute or two, but he wasn't letting up, and the whole town was out there throwing their hats up and hollering, And so finally he quit the bucking, and I rode him home, took the saddle off for his back, and I brought him up here, and we had some trails down there, and turned him out with some other horses there. And then I found out why they had him tied up in the trail. I would drive him in the trail with the horses, and as soon as I'd try to throw a rope on him, he'd just pop over the trail and go right over the top. So I'd have to turn the other horses out and get them with them, and then I'd go around them all up and put them back in. And every time I'd try to get a rope on him, he'd just pop over the trail. And finally I was putting bars on that trail, and I got it up as high as I could reach. And after 10 or 15 times him popping over the trail bars, I finally worked there for 2 days getting that trail high enough so that he couldn't jump over the top. And finally I got up to about 7 foot high, the bars, and if he'd get his nose through, then the bars would just fly. And we'd just scatter them. And so I finally decided that when I get him in that trail, I had to be real careful and get him back under the shed. And get him back there and then board that up. And so I boarded the shed up and left a place there where you could get through. And boarded the shed clear up to the ceiling. And after quite a while, I finally got him in there, and then I slapped some boards on the entry and boarded it up real tight, and got it clear up so he couldn't he couldn't get out. And then I got in there with my rope, and I left enough room so I could just lay flat on the ground and slide under. And so I got in there with my rope, and every time I'd throw the rope towards his head, he'd stick his nose up in the top of the shed and let the rope fall on. And so after about 4 or 5 hours, I finally succeeded in getting a rope on him. And then after I got that rope on him, I had to flop on my belly and go under there. He was at me with both paws just striking.
Oh, really?
And I had to just flatten out like a pancake and go under there and get away from him. But I finally jerked him up and he acted like he was going to behave all right. And so then I got my saddle and put on him. And I cinched it up and he threw his chest out and just popped the cinch. And, so I went downtown then and I got my new cinch put on it. And I thought that was a real good cinch, but I guess. So when I got my second cinch on there, why, he did the same thing. He just threw his chest out and popped the cinch and jumped out from under the saddle. And so then I went back to town and I got 2 cinches and put 2 cinches on him and he jumped around for about 5 minutes and finally broke both of those new cinches. And so I got to thinking, well, I wonder how I was able to hold him the first time. And my uncle's saddle, and so I went down and I said, "Is it all right if I borrow your saddle?" I said, "I'm going to have a good one." Well, he had one of these army hair cinches, the army ones, the good ones. And so when I cinched him up with that saddle, he tried to pop it, but he wasn't successful in doing it. So after a while, then I got on him. He'd let me on him before he'd start bucking. And I mean, he'd really buck. But after 3 days of trying to catch him, I didn't ever turn him loose. I kept him staked out. And when I'd get on him, he'd buck for about 5 minutes, and then we'd go to town on the dead run. I'd come out of that lane down there, you know how rough that is? I could run as hard as he'd go, and he would fall down with me and pass all the cars going to town. And after about a week, then he quit bucking with me. He decided he had enough bucking, and I'd jump on that horse and head for town. And I mean, and you could run right out through those cedars and sagebrush, and he'd never stumble. He was a single footer. We just rolled under it. He just rolled, and when I had to get downtown there and pull him up, get them first houses while the kids run in the house and say, "Come on out here comes Wilkerson." It's the horse. You know, people walk out on the sidewalks, you know, and all the way through town while people be out there. See me go through town, that horse had his head bowed way up and his feet just traveling, just rolling. And they'd watch me all the way through town. And I think that this had to be the Lord's doing. This had to that horse up. He knew I needed a little more confidence in what I had. Boy, some people scared me to death, and others didn't. But he knew that I needed confidence, and he set this up for me with his horse. And when I rode that horse, I just felt like a king, and he was. You could ride him for running for 3 or 4 miles and never get a side ache or nothing. You know, he just smooth as car, and it was just as pretty as anything you ever looked at. And so then later I got my call. I turned 18. I got greetings from Uncle Sam, and so my cousin, he lived up here, and I asked him, I said, "Do you want to buy this horse?" And he said, yeah, I want to buy him, but I ain't got any money. And I said, "Well, trade me something for him." But I want him back. If I get back in the service, I want this horse back. And so he said, "Well, I got a big calf I'll trade you, and you can take it down to the auction and get some money out of it." So I I let him have it. I thought, well, if I let him have it, I'll probably get it back. If I let somebody else have it, I'll never see that horse. And so, anyway, my uncle, he ridiculed me for buying the horse. He said, "You must be crazy, all the horse you got to get this horse." And I said, "Well, I didn't buy it. It was given to me." And he said, "Well, you can't afford to feed another horse." And then when my cousin got it, why, he said, I said, "Don't ever turn that horse loose. He stays good and fat, just take him out." I said, "Don't ever turn him loose." And he laughed at that. He says, "Oh," he says, "I'll turn him loose and I'll catch him." And he come dragging, went to the shed and he got a big log chain. It was that big around and 12 feet long. And he run a heavy strap and wrapped around 2 at a time, wrapped around his leg. And he says, "He ain't going to get away from me with that log chain." Well, it took him 3 days to catch that horse with that log chain. They get him in the corral and he'd take that log chain and just snap the bars right in. He'd go wham and throw that chain out in front of the guys that run and the bars splatter. And it took him 3 days to catch that horse and get him. I can't remember how that came about. I know I was up there every day trying to figure out devise a way to catch him, and we finally was able to do it. And he keeps saying, "I'm going to kill that horse. I'll shoot him in the head." And cousin Carl said, "No, you don't shoot him." And so anyway, when they got him in, they put him in they had a little stable and they put him in there and kept him and fed him hay. And my uncle was working over in the Montwell. It was about 8 miles from here over to Montwell. And he'd go over there to work and he'd ride that horse. And he claimed that he run that horse all the way, 8 miles. And when I talked to him later, he said, "This is the best horse in the whole world." And I said, "I know it." That's why I'm trusting in you guys. I said, "This is the best. They're not a better horse in the world." And he says, "Boy, you can say that again." And I said, "Take good care of that horse while I'm gone, because I want him back." And after, I guess, he'd rode it for several months while he was coming up from the Yola there. And the guy drove up the car from Salt Lake, a doctor or lawyer or something, seen him riding that horse and wanted that horse. He kept up in the price till he finally sold it. And of course, pretty poor people those days. I can't remember what he said, $400 or $500, and that it was too much to tempt him. He finally let him have that horse. And so, anyway, when I got home, I didn't have my horse, but that horse kept me all the way through the service, I think. Kept me buoyed up and thinking about, getting back and getting that horse riding. And I never seen him again, but that's another one of those miracles that happened in my life, that I know that was set up for me. The Lord knew that I needed more confidence, and He wanted to give me something to kind of boost my confidence and help me along the rough path that sometimes we have. But that was the most beautiful, and you just couldn't ride him far enough and long enough. He just go, and as I look back on that in my lifetime, I think, I wonder how a well-bred horse like that indeed would even come around in the basin. They had racehorses and things. He had to be something that was really special.
What about your car? Can you tell us about your car?
You don't want to hear all that.
Well, that was a pretty interesting story about your car. Tell us about your car.
But the car, after I left here and I went to Salt Lake and I got in construction, and it's kind of thinking about buying a car. I wasn't really serious about buying one. And I was driving down the road after work one day, and I passed this blue convertible had a for sale sign on it. And I went on past it, and the further I went, something kept telling me, to go back and check this out, And I thought, no, I can't afford no convertible. I was arguing with myself, and I was driving down the road, and finally after I got down the road about 10 miles, I turned my car around and went back and looked the convertible over, and went in and knocked on the door, and I says, how much do you want for this convertible? He says, $1,600. At that time, you could buy a new convertible for about $3,000. It was a year old and didn't have hardly any miles on it. And I said, well, how come you're selling it so cheap? And he says, well, my wife says I got to sell this or she's going to divorce me. And the reason found out that she was going to divorce him because he was putting every penny they had into that car. I mean, he put everything they had into it. And I didn't realize, I thought it was just a car. And anyway, I gave him some money, and I was driving that home, and I thought, boy, my mom's going to be mad at me for the car. And I got home, and she said, she was all excited. She said, well, that's the car I dreamed you bought. I seen this car in my dream.
Oh my gosh.
And she said, that's the very car. I said, what? I couldn't believe, she had dreamed I bought this convertible car. And so I felt pretty good that she felt pretty good about it. And anyway, as I drive that down the road, all the cops would pull me over. And they'd say, where did you get this car? And I said, oh, I just picked it up. Let me look under the hood. I got to see what you got under. They get under the hood, They shake their head to look, I didn't know what they were even looking at. For sure, I wasn't a hot rod guy. I didn't wasn't thinking about buying a hot rod car. I liked the looks of the car and it looked good. And so when I'd be on the highway, all these hot rodders would pull up beside me and they'd say, you want to race? And I said, no, I don't want to race. Oh, come on. So I just hit the throttle a little bit. Pretty soon I was out there about 20 feet, 30, and they'd want to wear wet, and they'd pick us off, And so anyway, I was working out at Kearns, and every day these kids that I worked with, they tried to build hot rod cars, and they'd wait for me till I got out there. And they'd go out there, and then when they'd see me coming, I'd like to show you tonight when they'd come and see if they could beat me, Mm-hmm. And I'd let them get up beside me, and then I'd just step on the throttle and zoom. And they didn't even know what you were at. So they'd go back every night and work on the cars and be ready for me. It went on for quite a while, but they finally gave up on that. And I went back to this guy one time and I said, well, man, that's some radio you got in there. I said, how did you perfect that radio like that? And he said 120 condensers. And I didn't know what he meant then, but everything he had done on that car, that was it. I mean, he was the one that built it to perfection. And you could turn the radio up on that car, and you could be down in the basement working, pounding it just like a loudspeaker car. It'd be so clear and so perfect. And the guy come up one day and he says, where's that speaker car? And I says, that's my radio on the car. Oh, no way. And I said, yeah, that's a radio. And so he looked around and he'd shake his head. I went up into Afton, Wyoming one time, and I was going along and I come to this new stretch of highway, and I thought, well, maybe I better really kind of test this car out a little bit. It only had 100 miles an hour on the thermometer, speedometer, and so anyway, I throttled it down to where I dare. I didn't ever dare push the throttle all the way on that, only just for a split second, you know, when the big guys want to race. But I clocked it from Green River over to another little town and drove at 110 miles an hour. And it was just like silk. I mean, when you step on the throttle, that thing, it just sucked right down the road. And he had let it down under the landing boards, had lead on it, you know, so that there wasn't any shimmy, no shake. That thing, that car didn't bobble at all. It would just suck to the road and just fly. And I never did dare push the throttle down, only just for seconds or two. Anyway, I started going back to this guy, and I'd ask him, I said, what do you do to this car, you know? And when I got up to where my cousin lived, it was 3 o'clock in the morning, and I thought, I wonder if I dare go and wake her up or just throw my sleep bag out here on the lawn. And I was sitting there debating, and pretty soon the car come in and slammed on his brakes and slid 2 around me. And by the time I got over that shock, here come another car and slammed on his brakes and slid around me. And they had, pretty soon there was about 10 cars. Had me all pinned in there. And they jumped out of the car and they said, can we look under your hood? And I don't know how they was up and heard me coming into town. And I said, well, I guess. I was trying to get shaken. I mean, those guys was out and they was under the hood and they was under the car and they was in the trunk, you know, going through that car, and they was shaking their head and they said, look at this, look at this. I didn't know what they was looking at. And after about a half hour, they wanted me to get out on the road and race with them. And I said, you guys wouldn't even know which way I went. And that made them so I ain't going to race with them. That made them so mad. They was fighting mad because I wouldn't race with them. But it was really strange how that came about. And so when I went back to that guy the last time, I said, how much money did you put in this car after you bought it? And he said, oh, about $3,500, I guess.
Oh my gosh.
It spent more money in fixing that than he spent for the car originally. And his wife said, no, you got it, that's got to go. And I never could figure out how I happened to be the one that got it, though, you know. I wasn't a hot rodder. I didn't, but when you went in that car, you knew you'd get back. You didn't have any worry about going and getting back. The only thing I ever did while I had that car was change the fan belt and the tires. I finally had to be a little careful around it. I was starting that, not put it in low gear to start it. You couldn't hear it spin the wheels, but evidently, I guess it was moving a little rubber off when it put low gear. But when I'd go uptown, I'd never wait when I'd pull up to the red light and I had to make a left-hand turn. I just zoomed around, and you guys wouldn't even be started. But everywhere I went, why cops would pull me over and want to look under the hood. And I guess that car really purred. Because they wanted to see what was under it, and they'd get all excited when they look under there. And anyway, I drove it to California 2 times, and took my mother, and we went down there 2 trips in the wintertime when it was slow, and we'd sit up in Beverly Hills in a convertible, and when the fog was in. And so when I got in the mission, called the wrong mission, I decided that I'd better sell that car. And so I took it in and traded it off. And when I come home, my mother said, where's your car? I said, well, I got rid of it. go on a mission. I said, you didn't have to do that. You didn't have to sell your car. And I said, yeah, I didn't think that the Lord wanted me to be out there on a mission and start and think about that car. But all my friends had said, there's no way you're going to get rid of your car and go on a mission. I had a good business going on, killing good and stuff. And you're not going to drop your business and go. And I said, yeah, I guess I better. The Lord's been patient long enough, you know. And I knew that I had to go on a mission. It came out in my patriarchal blessing years before that I was to go on a mission, and the Lord was real distinct about that. And I postponed it as long as I knew as I could. And but sometimes the winter sinking had something to do with that too, because that was quite a thing to give up that car, and in a way, and it might have been a little competition there, whether I'd go or not. But my mother was so mad at me for selling that car, and it was the right thing to do, because I've been out there thinking about it, but it was another miracle in my life that was set up, and I don't really know why, but it was that car was such a pleasure to ride in. It just,
What kind of a make was it?
it was a Ford, that he'd done everything, I guess, possible to make it a better car. He was like Tim. He kept working at it and putting things into it, and I never knew what was into that car in my lifetime that I had it. I really didn't know what was under the hood. I could see it was leaded down under the fenders so that there was no bubble, no sway, and you felt just as safe in that car under 10 miles an hour as you would at 60 miles an hour in any other car I had. Just step on the throttle and you just come right down to the road and just squat. And, but I wish sometimes later that I could have really found out how fast that car would go. Only time you ever throttled it was all the way, just for a split second to jump away from these guys that were bugging me. One of the days.
One from Chip's guys?
But like I say, it took a long time in my life to realize that these were things that the Lord helped me along with, and I don't know why exactly that I was privileged to get that car and that horse and those good things in my life that could have went to somebody else. It was I had quite a series of different things that happened. You want to shut that off, Mandy, over there? You want to shut it down?
Not wearing out on its hip.
You deserve something after that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Now, what stories have you guys got? You must have some stories too. Yeah, we want to hear theirs.
That's too good.
Don't take that.
Smells.
One more, yeah.